7 years passed by since the death of the king and queen of Calister. The throne had been empty for the past 7 years, for there was no other heir besides the two brothers. Salvador, being neither seen nor heard from, had been almost forgotten by the people of Calister. But Adakis was well known throughout the kingdom, not only for his title, but also for his charming air and his dashing appearance. Adakis prided himself in the confidence of his handsomeness, but physically, he could not compete with his friend Marcus, who had been raised by the men of honor to someday replace his father as the guardian. When he would enter a room, his confidence combined with his genuine kindness made him the center spectacle in a crowd. But beyond merely his warlike appearance was his resemblance to his father. On multiple occasions, Marcus had been mistaken for the lost guardian, and by this he was always deeply flattered. Adakis and Marcus, when not engaged in studies, enjoyed visiting the northern kingdom of Canadak together. The marketplace of Canadak was a thrilling and fascinating place to visit. Foreigners would pass through the land, selling and trading new things day after day, and it was there that the most splendid smelling foods and impressive adornments were bought and sold. Also gathering there were musicians who came to entertain the passerbys, and dancers who sought to captivate their audience with their beauty and grace. But it was the assemblage of these different customs, merchants, and townfolks that made the place of Canadak such an incredible place to visit. Marcus and Adakis would explore the ever-changing streets of Canadak, often, always anxious to find what new things awaited them there. But approaching soon was to be the next anniversary of the foundation of Canadak, and to celebrate, all of the people of the regions were gathering together in Canadak Market for one day in a massive festival to honor the goddess and revel in the abundance of blessings she had bestowed upon them. Adakis and Marcus were looking forward to the festival anxiously, and spoke of little else during the weeks leading up to it. But it was not until the night before the festival day that Adakis remembered his little brother Salvador, who had secluded himself in the chamber for the past 7 years. Despite the fact that he had been rejected every time he knocked on Salvador's door before this, Adakis was sure that his little brother would not want to miss the festival. Perhaps this, Adakis thought, would finally cause Salvador to leave his chamber and bring them back together as brothers again. With hope in his heart that he could be with his brother again, Adakis climbed the staircase up to Salvador's chamber. The staircase was silent, and a cold draft chilled Adakis to the bone. He heard Salvador pacing back and forth over the cold stone floor, and Adakis worried that his brother was restless and would be impatient with him. But to his surprise, as Adakis knocked on the door, he was greeted by a gentle response. "Who is there?" Taken aback, Adakis realized that Salvador must be very lonely in his chamber, despite his own choice to isolate himself. And with this in mind, Adakis announced himself with the same gentleness of voice that Salvador had used. Seeming to be grateful for the company, Adakis heard Salvador move closer to the door, until the two brothers were standing only inches apart, with nothing but the door between them. Adakis noticed that Salvador's voice was deeper, gruffer, but yet still gentle in the regard that there seemed to be a slight anxiety in his voice, a desire for company, and a gratefulness for Adakis' unexpected visit. However, when Adakis suggested that Salvador open the door for them to speak, he replied only with a low and firmly stated, "No." Undiscouraged, Adakis began to explain the anniversary of the foundation of Canadak and the festival to celebrate it. Adakis knew that Salvador had always loved Canadak during the few times he had been there as a child. The excitement of the crowd had thrilled him, and he had always longed to return. But Adakis could not understand Salvador's hesitation now as he struggled to make a decision. But at the mention that Marcus would be joining them, Salvador hesitated no longer. He had agreed. It seemed that Salvador had deeply missed his two companions. Salvador reassured his brother that he would most definitely join them to celebrate the festival in Canadak, telling Adakis that he would meet him for breakfast in the morning before leaving. Adakis was overjoyed at Salvador's agreement and bid his brother good night. Hardly having a moment of sleep that night, Adakis gazed up at the ceiling of his chamber as he rested atop his covers, wondering to himself what tomorrow would bring for them. Questions flooded into his mind, but above all was the feeling of joy in his mind that night. He would finally be seeing his brother again. The next day, when Marcus arrived early in the morning, as usual, Adakis relayed the news that Salvador would be joining them soon, and would be spending the entire day with them. Marcus seemed overjoyed at the thought of seeing Salvador again. Salvador had been almost like a brother to Marcus, as he considered Adakis to be. Sitting across the table from each other in the dining hall, with cups of tea, a plate stacked with rusk biscuits, and a vessel of fresh honey between them, Marcus and Adakis began to discuss many things surrounding the evening. Soon, they found themselves questioning what Salvador would look like after all of these years. At first, they suspected that he would look the same, only a bit taller. But after some time, they had conjured many theories in their minds. They wondered if Salvador's hair had grown more silver during the years that had passed. But they both agreed that the scribe's warnings had halted the spreading of his silver hair. They were both anxious not only for the festival that evening, but to finally see Salvador again after all these years. He would be over 17 years old by this time, and although he was still very young, Adakis could not begin to picture what his brother would look like. But even now, by the tone of his brother's voice through the door, Adakis could tell Salvador was no longer the weak young child he had known him to be. Adakis and Marcus had only been sitting at the table for a few minutes when they heard the door at the top of the stairs creak open. Adakis felt his heart begin to race, and he realized that he would finally see his brother again. The staircase was spiraled, so they would not be able to see Salvador until he had reached nearly the bottom step. But they could hear his even steps falling on each stair, and they could hear his hand running smoothly along the marble guardrail as he slowly descended from his chamber. When at last Salvador turned into view, Adakis let out the breath he had been holding. No trace remained of the frail young child he had known in his youth. In his place was a towering figure with broad shoulders and a powerful stance. His midnight black hair streamed down his back without a tangle, but his stern face was clean-shaved down to the skin. His eyes were glistening blue, possibly the only trait that had survived the years that had passed. His gentle blue eyes scanned over the room, as though Salvador were gazing into a distant memory. Adakis had never imagined that his brother's appearance could have been so altered by time, but it was undeniable that he had grown over the passing years. Though not having the warrior-like pose of Marcus, Salvador would certainly be a worthy match for his strength. It took Adakis a moment to realize that Salvador was staring at him, waiting for him to speak. But before he could find the words to, Marcus rose to his feet and called out Salvador's name with a beaming smile. A grin appeared on Salvador's stern lips, and a glimmer appeared in his bright blue eyes. Marcus rushed to his side and shook Salvador's hand, grasping his arm, telling him that it had been too long. Adakis could see the surprise in Marcus's eyes as he gripped Salvador's arm for a moment and felt the taut muscle there. Also, Marcus could see that he and Adakis had been correct. The silver hair had not spread since the scribe's warnings. Adakis rose to his feet, still speechless at the sight of his brother. Salvador slowly approached him while listening to the sound of his boots falling heavily on the stone, asking Adakis, somewhat jokingly, what he was staring at. Adakis laughed and complimented his brother on his appearance. Sitting down together at the table, the three of them shared a plate of rusk and tea, and they talked. But for some reason, they never discussed what it was Salvador had been doing in his chamber for the past 7 years, or why he had not left his room in all that time. It had been long since Salvador had seen his brother and his companion. He missed them and loved them very dearly. But even greater than the love in his heart was a far deeper emotion that had been brewing in his soul ever since the loss of his parents. And this feeling had been slowly building inside of him over the past 7 years, and had given him the power to prepare himself physically for the task that would soon be at hand. The afternoon waned, and all too soon Adakis found that it was time to prepare for leaving for the festival. But he had enjoyed every moment he spent sitting at the table in the dining hall with Salvador and Marcus. It felt as though all was returning to the way it had been, to the way he remembered life had been. Even after the hours began to slip by, Adakis found himself still in awe of Salvador's new appearance. He wondered how strictly Salvador had disciplined himself over the years. It was undeniable that Salvador was far more striking in appearance than he was now. Adakis had never been bothered that Marcus was stronger than him, but for some reason it bothered him that his younger brother had become so. But pushing aside these strange feelings that invaded his mind, Adakis found that even in his curious apprehension, he had not been this happy in a very long time. To have his brother back at his side was the most important thing in the world to him.